The iron door closed behind him with a heavy clang that echoed through the entire corridor. Every man in the holding block turned to look. That was normal. New arrivals always drew attention. What was not normal was what happened next. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The usual noise of the block, the arguments, the tapping on walls, the low murmur of men passing time, stopped completely. Not because anyone decided to stop. It just happened, like birds going silent before a storm. The new prisoner walked slowly to the empty cot at the far end of the cell. He sat down. He placed his hands on his knees, and then he looked at the floor, calm and still, like a man sitting in his own living room. His name on the intake form was Darian Wolf. No home address, no employer, no emergency contact. The officers who had brought him in had found him unconscious, inside an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city. His wrists had been tied with wire. His shirt was torn. There was a long cut above his left eye that had dried dark. Whoever had left him there had done so with the clear intention that he would not be found. He had been found anyway. At the front desk, Sergeant Lena Marsh reviewed his file and found almost nothing useful inside it. No criminal record, no prior arrests, no verified identity beyond the name he had given, which she immediately suspected was not his real one. She had worked in that facility for 12 years. She had processed hundreds of men. She knew the difference between a man hiding from the law and a man hiding from something else entirely. She walked to the cell block and looked at him through the reinforced glass. He had not moved. He was still sitting in the same position, hands on his knees, eyes on the floor, but there was something about the way he sat that made her pause. He was not slouching the way frightened men slouch. He was not tense the way guilty men are tense. His back was straight, his breathing was slow. He looked, she thought, like a man who was simply waiting, the way a person waits for a train they know will come. She went back to her desk and wrote in her report, "Manner unusually composed. Recommend further identity verification." The other detainees felt it too, though none of them could explain it clearly. A man named Cal, who had been in the facility 3 times before and considered himself something of an authority on reading people, sat on his cot that first evening and watched the new arrival eat his food quietly, without complaint, without looking around. Cal had seen big men come through those doors. He had seen confident men, angry men, men who tried to take over a room the moment they entered it. This was different. This man was not trying to take over anything. He simply sat there, and somehow the room rearranged itself around him. It was like, Cal would later say, struggling for the right words, the room decided he was in charge. Not him, the room. Darian Wolf said very little during those first 2 days. When the guard brought food, he said thank you. When the facility nurse came to treat the cut above his eye, he sat perfectly still and let her work. When a younger detainee tried to start a conversation by asking what he was in for, Darian looked at him with calm, dark eyes and said, "Resting," and said nothing more. On the morning of the second day, Sergeant Marsh slid a cup of coffee through the slot in the cell door. It was not something she normally did. She was not entirely sure why she did it. Darian looked up, and in a quiet, even voice said, "Thank you, Sergeant." She walked back to her desk and sat down, and stared at the wall for a long moment. He had said it the way a man says thank you when he is used to being served, not arrogantly, not dismissively, but with a natural ease that suggested it was simply the correct way to address people. It was a small thing, but it stayed with her all morning. By the afternoon of the second day, something unusual happened at the front desk. 3 separate lawyers arrived within the space of 4 hours. Each one came from a different firm. Each one claimed to represent the man in cell 7, and each one, when pressed on who had hired them, gave the same polite but firm answer. They were not at liberty to say. Director Holt, who oversaw the facility, was informed. He authorized a deeper identity check immediately. The fingerprints that had been taken at intake were run through every available database, regional, national, and international. The officer who received the results stood up from his chair. He read the screen again. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor without saying a single word. When the supervisor arrived, the officer simply turned the monitor around. The prints belonged to a man named Darian Aelric Wolf Kazan, a man who, according to every official record in existence, had been dead for 4 years. What followed was not a simple case review. What followed was the careful, methodical unraveling of something that had been buried very deliberately and very deeply. Darian Aelric Wolf Kazan had not been an ordinary man. He had been the head of something called the Kazan Alliance, a union of 12 powerful highland clans, bound together by generations of tradition, shared land, and a formal oath that went back over 200 years. The clans governed themselves through their own system of law. They resolved disputes through their own process. They managed their land, their resources, and their agreements through their own structure. And at the center of all of it sat one figure, one person who held the authority to speak for all 12 clans, to settle what could not otherwise be settled, to hold the oath together when it was tested. That person carried a title that had existed for as long as the alliance itself. The Alpha King. It was not a ceremonial title. It was not symbolic. It carried real authority over real things: land boundaries, resource agreements, clan law, conflict resolution across a territory that stretched for hundreds of miles through the highland regions. The Alpha King was not elected by popularity. He was recognized by demonstrated character, by lineage, and by the agreement of the clan elders. Once recognized, the position was held for life, protected by the oath itself. Darian had held that position since the age of 31. By every account, he had held it well. And then, in the spring of 2015, he had disappeared. The official story, released quietly and without much detail, was that he had passed away from a sudden illness. A private ceremony had been held. A successor had been named, one of his closest advisors, a man who had stood beside him for years. The alliance had continued. Life had moved on. But life had not simply moved on. Not for everyone. What the investigation now began to uncover, piece by piece, was that Darian had not died. He had been removed. His inner circle, men he had trusted completely, men he himself had brought into positions of power, had made an arrangement with outside interests. Those interests wanted access to highland land that the alliance controlled. That access could not be purchased or negotiated while Darian led the alliance. He was too careful, too principled, too aware of what certain agreements would cost his people in the long term. So a decision had been made. They could not end his life openly. The blood oath forbade it, and any violation would have fractured the alliance immediately and brought consequences no one wanted. So instead, they did something more calculated. They removed him quietly. Drugs, transport, falsified records, a death that existed only on paper. They left him with no identity, no resources, no way to prove who he was. They scattered him into the world and trusted that a man alone, with nothing, would eventually disappear on his own. They had underestimated him considerably. For 4 years, Darian had lived carefully and quietly. He moved between cities. He worked when he needed to work. He trusted no one fully. He kept no phone, no permanent address, nothing that could be traced. But he had not been simply surviving. He had been doing something else at the same time, something slow and patient and methodical. He had been gathering evidence. Every document, every testimony, every financial record that connected his disappearance to the people who had arranged it, he had been collecting these things one at a time, over 4 years, with the patience of a man who understood that rushing would ruin everything. He was not ready to move yet. He needed more time. Someone had found out how close he was. The warehouse had not been a random location. He had been followed, caught off guard, overpowered, and left there deliberately. It was not meant to be a permanent solution. It was meant to be a warning. A message delivered without words. Stop, step back, stay invisible, stay gone. Instead, he had been found by a passing security guard who noticed a broken window and called it in, and instead of disappearing again, Darian had ended up in a facility where his fingerprints were on file, where a sergeant with good instincts had flagged his behavior, and where a full identity check had been ordered. None of this appeared to surprise him. Back in the cell, his behavior did not change at all after the lawyers arrived. He sent all 3 of them away with the same message, delivered in the same quiet tone. Tell them I am not ready yet. The guards who escorted the lawyers out exchanged looks but said nothing. He continued to eat his meals. He slept regularly. Each morning, When the newspaper was brought to the block, he read it from the first page to the last, slowly, without skipping anything. He watched the facility with the same careful attention he gave the newspaper, the shift changes, the camera positions, the patterns of movement in the corridor. He watched without appearing to watch. Sergeant Marsh noticed it. She had worked with enough people to recognize someone who was gathering information while appearing to do nothing at all. On the third day, she asked him directly, through the cell door, whether there was anything he needed. He looked up at her. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "But I appreciate you asking." She stood there for a moment, feeling slightly uncertain, which was unusual for her. "You don't seem worried," she said. He considered that for a moment. "There is nothing here that requires worry," he said simply. "Everything is moving the way it should." She walked away from that conversation with the strange and unshakable feeling that he was right, and that he had known it long before any of them did. On the 7th morning, at exactly 14 minutes past 6, a convoy of vehicles arrived outside the facility. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. The vehicles were dark and moved quietly. 11 people stepped out onto the pavement in the early light. They were not police officers. They were not lawyers in the conventional sense. They were men and women dressed in the formal traditional clothing of the Highland clans. Deep colors, careful details, the kind of clothing worn for occasions of serious significance. Their leader was an elderly woman who walked with a carved wooden staff and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in her life needed to rush to be taken seriously. Her name was Mira Kazan. She was Darian's aunt. She had also been listed as deceased for 3 years. She walked to the front desk. She placed a document on the counter. She did not explain it. She did not argue. She simply placed it there and waited. What she had placed on that counter had taken years to assemble. It was a formal legal declaration, prepared under Highland clan law, reviewed and certified by 2 international legal bodies, and filed simultaneously that same morning with 3 national courts and 1 international oversight commission. It contained a complete account of everything that had happened to Darian Wolf Kazan since 2015. It named, in precise and documented detail, every person involved in his disappearance. It named the officials who had falsified his death records. It named the financial backer who had funded the arrangement in exchange for land access rights that he was never legally entitled to receive. It named the members of Darian's former inner circle who had initiated and carried out the plan. And it named Darian Elric Wolf Kazan as the living, rightful Alpha King of the Kazan Alliance, a position he had never legally vacated, because a position held under blood oath cannot be vacated by deception. The facility's legal team reviewed the documents for 45 minutes. Then Director Holt stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked personally to the cell block. He stopped outside cell 7. Darian was sitting on the cot, in the same calm posture, hands on his knees. He looked up when Holt stopped at the door. He did not look relieved. He did not look triumphant. He looked the way he had looked every single day, measured, steady, present. Holt held the documents at his side. He opened his mouth and said, "Mr. Wolf," and then stopped. The name felt wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started again. "Sir," he said, and that felt closer to correct. "It appears you are free to go." Darian stood. He was unhurried. He smoothed the front of his worn shirt with both hands. He looked around the small cell once, not with bitterness, not with relief, but with a quiet, almost reflective attention, the way a person looks at a place they know they will not forget. "I know," he said. The corridor that he walked out through was lined on both sides with facility staff who had heard what was happening and had come out of their offices and posts. Nobody had planned this. It simply occurred. People stepped into the hallway and stood there as Darian walked past them, and nobody spoke, and nobody needed to explain why they had come. Outside, in the early morning light, the 11 clan representatives were waiting. When Mira Kazan saw him, she did not rush forward. She stood straight and looked at him across the distance with dark, serious eyes. Then she pressed her right hand to her heart. The others did the same, one by one, without being told. It was a gesture of formal recognition. It was the greeting given to the Alpha King by those who stood under the oath. It had not been performed for anyone in 4 years. Darian crossed the distance between them. He stood before his aunt and looked at her for a long moment. Then he placed his hand over his own heart, returning the gesture. "You took your time," she said quietly. "I needed more," he said. She studied his face, the cut that was still healing, the weariness that lived behind the steadiness in his eyes, the 4 years written into him in ways that did not show on the surface, but were present nonetheless. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they understand something that does not need to be said out loud. The arrests connected to his disappearance began within the week. The land agreements signed under false authority were frozen, pending full legal review. The man who had been named as his successor, who had led the alliance for 4 years under an authority he had never truly held, stepped down without being asked, before the formal proceedings could require it. Darian gave one public statement. It was short. He thanked no government institution. He named no enemies. He made no dramatic declarations. He said only that the clans had held together through a difficult period, that the oath had proven stronger than the people who had tried to break it, and that the work of repair and rebuilding was more important, and more worthy of attention, than any story of what had been done to him. People expected more. They expected something sharper, something more pointed. They expected a man who had spent 4 years with nothing to have something urgent to say about the people who had taken everything from him. He did not give them that. He folded the paper with his statement, placed it in his jacket pocket, and walked away from the cameras without looking back. Sergeant Lena Marsh returned to work on the morning after the story had spread across every news channel, and sat at her desk and thought about the 7 days that had just passed. She thought about the convoy of black vehicles. She thought about the elderly woman with the carved staff. She thought about the document that had changed everything in under an hour. But what she kept coming back to, again and again, was a much smaller moment. The second morning. The cup of coffee she had slid through the slot for no particular reason she could name. The way he had looked up. The way he had said, in that quiet and completely certain voice, "Thank you, Sergeant," as if he had always known her name, as if the cell around him was simply a temporary inconvenience in an otherwise orderly life, as if he had never, not for one single moment in those 7 days, forgotten exactly who he was. She thought that was the most remarkable thing of all. Not the convoy, not the documents, not the formal recognition on the pavement in the early morning light. Just a man in a torn shirt, sitting on a cot in a cold cell, who never once needed the world to tell him what he already knew about himself.